Welcome back to another episode of Dance Med Spotlight, where we talk about all things dance medicine and dance science. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Jason Harrison, a strength and conditioning coach based out of Dayton, Ohio and New York, co-owner of Present Tense Fitness. In this episode, we talk about not only things like what are the differences between a strength and conditioning coach and a personal trainer or other fitness professionals. What does programming need to look like for dancers? How is that individualized? What should our cross-training look like, and how much should it be like dance versus not like dance? But we also talk about other things like the use of mirrors or lack thereof, the importance of the words that we use, obtaining consent with people that we work with, some of the other things that we need to be aware of when we are working with dancers. There's also advice for dancers, for studio owners, artistic directors themselves, and what to do with some of this information. Be sure to check out this episode. There's a lot of really good stuff with it. Welcome back to another episode of Dance Med Spotlight, where we talk about all things dance medicine and dance science. Today, I am super excited for my guest, who I met at the last IADMS conference, the International Association for Dance Medicine and Science, none other than Jason Harrison. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, Jason, give us a quick overview. This is always kind of my number one question for folks. What got you in this space of working within the dance medicine and dance health realm?
I think basically it was just sort of like seeing a gap and an opportunity and deciding to try to fill that gap. That's the simple answer. I think maybe the more nuanced answer is, I think, I had a conventional personal training business, and I just wanted to attach more meaning to that. And so I think the dance world, we started the brick and mortar iteration of Present Tense Fitness in Dayton, Ohio, which is a city of 140,000 people, but it used to be much larger, and it has sort of like some of the bones of bigger cities. And one of the things that it has is like these amazing dance companies in Dayton for such a small city. And so, we just decided, let's talk to some of the people in town. So there's the Dayton Contemporary Dance Company and Dayton Ballet. And so we just brought people in and asked a million questions. And it just sort of started from there.
That's awesome. I think a question that's an important one before we get too far into our conversation for folks who are listening. A lot of times, whether it's other professionals or people just in the public don't have a good understanding of some of the different professions that are out there or how we serve the populations that we work with. What is a strength and conditioning coach versus maybe sort of the typical personal trainer or other types of folks that people might be aware of out in the fitness space?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I think the main distinguishing characteristic between a personal trainer and a strength coach is that a strength and conditioning coach, their job is to evaluate the needs, the movement needs of somebody who uses their body with intention, either, in some cases recreationally, or like at an amateur level, or at a professional level, or somebody who's pre-professional wanting to do something with their body for a living. And so, whereas a personal trainer, oftentimes the job, and about half of the work I do is still personal training with what I call general population clients. And the general population work and the dance work sort of mutually inform one another. But a personal trainer's job is just to, oftentimes people like come to a personal trainer because they want to be healthier. They want to move with some intention, but they don't have aspirations to, dance professionally or play baseball professionally or something like that. They just want to be like relatively pain-free, and be able to do the things that they want to do in their everyday lives. I think the concern that a strength and conditioning coach has that maybe personal trainers don't necessarily is managing fatigue, rest, and recovery. For somebody who, by definition, if they're using their body for their job, there's obviously like a large degree of fatigue that sets in just from them doing that activity. And so as the strength and conditioning coach, your job is to evaluate like how much stress they already have on their body, and then see where you can fit in to help make them stronger, or prepare, make them stronger like during the season, and then in the off season you're sort of preparing them for what's to come. But in the case of like, depending on the size of the dance company, sometimes they don't have real off seasons in the way that we would think in terms of other sports. And so then it's even a more complex problem of trying to address the needs of the dancer while not getting in the way of their actual work.
That brings up a really important question for our dancers of this idea of rest and recovery. We know, I work a lot with adolescent dancers who are maybe in the pre-professional space or competitive dancers, and they have so many hours of class and rehearsal and shows and performances and all these different things. So when we start having these conversations of how do we work in some exercise and programming or working with other folks that they could benefit from working with? It's like,
Yep.
How am I going to make this happen? What are some of the things that you've seen working with your dancers?
I mean, you put your finger on it. I mean, it's especially the younger dancers are basically over scheduled. And I like, so my initial background, my academic background and my initial professional background was as a political science. I had a political science focus, and so I always think of like the larger contextual situation here. And so, like, if you look at like just kids across the board now, a lot of them are just overscheduled. It's like soccer practice to play date to, like all these things that are like scheduled. And then
Yeah.
the dance culture just sort of like weaponizes that. And so, the idea is for a lot of parents and their children who want to dance, the thinking is always that more is always better. And there's not oftentimes good coordination or communication between people at dance studios or dance teachers and other people. Then you just end up with like overwork because they're doing, one dance teacher is doing, if you look at like a school setting, maybe a dancer has a class in the morning and that teacher decides to do like a lot of jumping. And then later that afternoon, that teacher decides to do a lot of jumping. And so now we've probably overprescribed jumping on this individual because there's not coordination. And so, my job when I'm working, especially with a young person, is to ask them like, what does your week look like? What will your week look like? What does your day look like? How have you slept? How have you, are you fueled? All of those sort of things, because you're, as the strength and conditioning coach, again, you're not trying to get in the way. You're not trying to exacerbate already existing overwork, overschedule. And so, it's about finding oftentimes the minimum effective dose. Like, how can I make this person stronger while not adding unnecessary cumulative fatigue to an already fatigued body?
Something that you said there, I think, is a really important thing to highlight for folks listening or watching this idea of asking the dancer that you're working with what their day, their week, their month looks like as we're doing any sort of programming, whether it's from a physical capacity, mental stuff, whatever it is that we're working on, getting an understanding of what their time and what their space even looks like so
Yep.
that we can complement it and not feel like we're adding to the overwhelm or anything like that.
Yep. Yep. That's right. I mean, honestly, that's just the job of any competent professional, working with somebody who, we all have bodies. And so there's a lot of different inputs that affect the performance of that body. And so It's just
Mhm.
doing that due diligence is just a baseline. Like you have to understand like where the person is, or you're not really doing your job.
Yeah, most definitely. I know one thing that you spoke about in your presentation at IADMS last year was this idea of programming, tapering, some of these
Mm.
different concepts. Talk about that a little bit for folks who are listening.
Yeah, the dance world, I mean, one of the things I think about a lot is this sort of unnecessary divide between, the dance medicine world on the one hand and the strength and conditioning world on the other hand. And there's a wide gulf between the two. And that gulf actually explains sort of like what we see in dance culture generally, and sort of like the absence of this thinking of preparing a mover for the rigors of their activity. And so
Mhm.
if you look at like almost any other sport, what's the thing that matters the most is when it comes time to perform or to play. And so like the thing I always think about is like, if you are the strength coach for I went to Ohio State, and so in Ohio, in the Midwest, like, American football is sort of like almost a religion.
Yeah.
So I use this as an example, but like if I'm the strength coach for Ohio State football and I take the star running back through a just brutal workout on Thursday and they can't perform effectively on Saturday, then I should be fired as the strength coach because I've impeded their ability to perform. In the dance world, it's almost the opposite. It's like we're going to throw everything at you, including on the in some cases like the day of a performance.
Yeah.
And if you can survive that, then congratulations, you can perform. And so in terms of programming and tapering and all of that stuff, it's understanding schedule. It's looking at the like a year long schedule of a dancer and understanding where some of those peaks and valleys are and where you can plug in to get a little bit more work when you have to back off somewhat. The programming should change almost by definition. Like for a ballet dancer, when Nutcracker season comes around, we know that that's going to be like physically demanding just because of the volume of work. And so the programming should reflect that. The programming should be like, how do I still make this person strong, but back
Mhm.
way off on volume to sort of like mitigate the risks of cumulative fatigue during that like peak of the year. And so like what you see a lot of times in dance culture is people just like either either just following like random YouTube videos, or just buying these like one-off little programs to, and this is, I mean, this is not a dunk on the people who do this, because like making a living in fitness is mostly impossible. Um, but selling like work on your extensions, buy my 4-week program on just extensions, and it's just like, but yes, you need to work on the artistic feedback that you get, but like you can't just sideline all of the other general physical preparedness for this one aspect. And you
Mhm.
see dancers either following random things or things that are so specific that they risk sort of like leaving other physical attributes on the table, and including, what
Mhm.
I think is like probably the most important, especially for younger dancers, is that general physical preparedness.
Yeah.
Um, and so that programming is just such an important part of this work. And I think it's probably one of the things that is least understood in the dance world, like how much having a thoughtful program that builds week over week, month over month, and in terms of like younger dancers thinking
Mhm.
about long-term athletic development year over year.
Yeah.
It all has to be thoughtful and intentional.
One of the things I've gotten in the habit of asking my young dancers is, what are their goals with dance? That's
Yeah.
always in my intake session. Is it something they're doing for fun, maybe for fitness as a hobby right now while they're in school? Do they want to pursue a dance degree, pursue it professionally? And if they want to do it professionally, do they think they want to be a commercial dancer? Do they want to be, a soloist with the Bolshoi Ballet? Who knows what? But getting that answer also helps guide me a little bit in all of our discussions and programming for that longevity piece, and what all I want them to understand about their health and wellness and what they need to consider, and all of those different pieces, and adding that into my intake session has been huge for how I'm interacting with them.
Yeah. I mean, that obviously that makes perfect sense. I mean, understanding, I mean, that's one of my favorite questions to ask is like, is it's what are what are your goals? And then also like what type of feedback are you getting? Somebody who's pursuing, a different types of dance, like if it's like a Balanchine person, like they may get different artistic feedback than somebody who's in a contemporary dance company. And so that can help also build like some buy-in, because they know a lot of the stuff that I do with people looks nothing like dance, and the connection between what we do and dance is maybe not obvious because it doesn't look like dance. And so asking those specific questions around their goals can help also generate some buy-in, because they know that it's something you care about, and you can circle back to that during the course of a session. Like, oh, you said you wanted to work on your extension height to the side and turnout or whatever. This is something that we're doing to address that. And so that a lot of times that can just be like from an emotional standpoint, a really helpful thing for a young dancer to hear.
Mm-hmm. That also is a lovely segue into another idea of how we're doing training with dancers. Things, I think a lot of times they gravitate towards Pilates, yoga, programs like progressing ballet technique, PBT. There are a lot of really great ways to work on health and fitness and things like that. But then there's also this idea of using things that look nothing like dance as part of their training. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, in fact, I would say, I mean, the in terms of like, depending on what the goal is. So if somebody's rehabbing an injury, or there's a technique thing that has like led to some pain or something like that, a really good Pilates teacher with a dance background can help marry the Pilates movement to the dance movement, and that's like a wonderful thing. And I've seen that in practice. Um, in terms of athleticism, explosiveness, um, conditioning, and when somebody in my world uses the word conditioning, we're talking about cardiovascular conditioning specifically. Um, Jumping, landing, all these like athletic attributes. There is no substitute for strength and conditioning. Like there's just no, you can't load things in the same way with these other modalities. I mean, yoga can be a wonderful all-encompassing practice, and I know people for whom yoga has literally changed their lives. And so I would never dunk on yoga as a practice. I mean, there's four of us at Present Tense Fitness. One of our coaches was a yoga teacher first, and so it marries the practices of strength and conditioning and yoga together. So, but when it comes down to it, there's just no substitute for actual strength and conditioning. I'm forgetting the actual question you asked.
Yeah. So just kind of like doing training that looks like dance versus training
Right.
that doesn't
Yeah.
look
Yeah.
like.
Yeah. Yeah. So the thing is, like, I've had some really interesting discussions. There's a really famous physical therapist who I had a really interesting discussion at the Adams where you and I met,
Mhm.
and she said something really interesting to me and I didn't agree with her approach, but I respect it and I understand the spirit of it. And what she was saying was that for a lot of the dancers that she works with, the more something looks like dance, this goes back to the idea of buy-in that I talked about earlier. The more something looks like dance, the easier she's able to get buy-in from some of the artists that she works with. And so it's just like, if the goal is to get people to consistently train, then her point of view was like, do what you have to do to get them in the gym, and that'll be better than them not being in the gym. And I
Mhm.
respect that. And this individual I really have an enormous amount of respect for. They've really been leaders in the field. My point of view on this, though, is that part of the reticence people have around being in a training space is people like me have not made training spaces welcoming to people who are drawn to the arts. And so
Mm.
here, like, you have to talk about like things like gender fluidity and sort of like the hyper masculine space of a gym setting that people are sort of used to. People think back to like literally middle school gym class, like they think about like these spaces, and so they're a
Yeah.
lot of times they sort of feel like, well, that's not for me. And for me, rather than changing um a goblet squat to look more dance like, for me it's it's using the most effective tool for the job that we're trying to accomplish, and then creating a space in which everyone feels welcome and seen and safe and
Mhm.
empowered. And that's really the work. You don't change the exercise, you change the environment around it, because the exercises, a goblet squat knows no gender, a goblet squat knows no sexuality. Like, a goblet squat is
Mhm.
just a goblet squat, and it's a wonderful tool because we can progressively overload it, we can hold people accountable for their form. And it's a wonderful way of just building overall strength. And so I
Mhm.
don't want to rob anybody of the opportunity to do such an effective exercise, because they're afraid of like the environments that, and the really sort of like toxic fitness culture have created and perpetuated over time.
Mhm.
So
Yeah. That reminds me of another thing from your presentation at Adams last year, talking about how we're actually setting up the space that we're working with our clients in,
yeah,
whether that is the equipment that we have for them to use, like are we using kettlebells, are we using dumbbells, whatever, but also, and this was something that just like really struck me as you said it, mirrors, use
yeah,
of mirrors or absence of mirrors.
yeah.
And so, based off of what you had said, I actually immediately went back to the clinic when I got back and ordered some curtains and a curtain rod and put curtains
Mm,
over my mirrors on the wall so that I can
mm,
open it and use them when I choose to, or I can close them and not have them there if it's not the appropriate time or space for it. Talk
yeah,
about that concept a little bit that I'm alluding to there with the mirrors.
yeah. I mean, for me, there's two reasons. Number one, when I'm training someone, I don't want them looking in a mirror to get feedback on their form, because you don't, when, part of one of the things with strength training is that um, we're not just training people to be athletic and explosive and have the strength and the stamina and the jumping power on stage. They also have to live. They're also people first and primarily, right? And
Mhm.
so, like, if somebody has, they get the Costco size like kitty litter and they have to get it out of a trunk or something like that, like, there's no mirror to check your form to make sure that you're engaging properly and not going to hurt yourself. You need to just
Yeah.
feel that in your body. So that's the substantive reason, sort of like the biomechanical reason. I strongly believe in that. And then the second reason is just like the emotional aspect of it. When there are mirrors, people look at themselves in the mirror. And that's irrespective of whether they're a dancer or a general population client. People, like, you just can't help yourself. Like, there's a mirror. And so you look at it. I and the for dancers in particular, like, their entire life is basically scrutiny. So
Mhm.
people are looking at them, and like, despite what people say, and despite sort of like, people understanding that there are things that you shouldn't ethically say to dancers, they know that people are looking at their bodies specifically for specifically whether that, artistic director or whoever, choreographer, um, deems that body an appropriate level of appealing, whatever that
Mhm.
means. And usually what that means is thin.
Hmm.
And so when people are with me, I don't want them thinking about that. I want them thinking about like what their body can do and not what it looks like. And when there are mirrors, it just immediately gets in the way of that. And like I noticed this too. So like I still co-own the studio in Dayton, Ohio. I live in New York City now, and so I'm training out of other spaces. Um, and when there are mirrors, I check myself out too. Like that, like that's just
Hmm.
human. That's just human nature. But then you're in your head about like what your body looks like
Hmm.
versus what it can do. And when people are focused on what their body can do, that's almost always a healthier approach from what I've
Hmm.
seen from like 9 out of 10 people. Some people can beat themselves up if they don't like if they expect a personal record on a lift or something like that. I mean, that can also get in people's way. But for the most part, if people are evaluating like what they look like, it's getting in the way of the work that we're actually trying to do. Because
Hmm.
people can be doing wonderfully in the gym, and I see this all the time. But it's like, but I don't like this. I don't like this look. Can we do something for this little patch of like just human flesh here? Like
Hmm.
I don't want that.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a dual reason for the no mirror thing with us.
And the dancers, I mean, most dance studios, it's at least one wall of like
Yeah,
full mirrors, if not, I've seen some where they have like a couple of walls and all sorts of different things. I have seen a couple of studios now, just in more recent years, where they do have curtains up where they can close them at times. But
yeah,
I mean, they're surrounded by mirrors all the time and
yep,
often told to look in the mirrors and that sort of thing.
yep,
And so, yeah, breaks from them are a wonderful thing.
yeah, for sure, for sure.
Going back to some of the training concepts that we were talking about before, and strength training, the approach of having something that looks more like dance versus less like dance. I know one of the things I always talk with my dancers about too is the balance of the human body to support them being a human, like you said, where
Yeah,
ballet, for example, they live in turnout. Their
yeah,
rotator muscles for external rotation tend to do fairly well, but the ones going internal rotation, they don't know what the heck they're supposed to be doing in comparison. And so doing exercises to uptrain the opposite of where the dancer kind of lives all the time can help
yeah.
just maintain their balance as a human too.
Yeah, and so like the internal external rotation thing is a really great point. And I would say probably so like I know you've heard people sort of like get on dancers for like, oh, you're overpronating. And so dancers get
Mhm.
really afraid of like being on the inside of their foot. But you can't like you need pronation to access internal rotation. And so some of it is like exactly what you're saying. Like as a human, we need like for hip health, we need access to internal rotation. But I would also say it's like sort of an undervalued aspect of being a dancer, like actually performing is like having some degree of internal rotation. Obviously, you need like a lot of external rotation, but you need some internal rotation also
Mhm.
in order to be able to jump, in order to be able to land effectively. And depending on the type on the style of dance, if there's groundwork, like you need internal rotation to be able to get into to all of that stuff. So
Mhm.
some of it's yes, exactly right. Like just as a human being, we need access to all these things. But
Mhm.
I would say there's like some undervalued aspects just as performers too, for some of the stuff that you can train outside of the studio.
Mhm. One of the things I also notice is with the idea of flexibility.
Hmm.
Always wanting to stretch, 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 live in their splits, that's a warm up, that sort of stuff, versus actually learning to move and control through increased ranges of motion and having the strength to support all of that.
Yeah, yeah. I there's in the strength and conditioning world, there's all this talk about like mobility and flexibility, and there's people who've just built entire careers and big followings on, I'm the mobility guru or whatever, or I'm just like the strength guru. You don't need to stretch, you don't need to do it, any of that. What I would say, like for dancers, is you actually need like a truckload of flexibility in order to get into the shapes that are required to be a dancer. Um, and so I'm not anti stretching.
Hmm.
But what I would say is, as you sort of alluded to, closing the gap between what our bodies can get into passively and then what we can actively control, closing that gap as much as possible. So getting stronger at these end ranges of motion,
Hmm.
ultimately, I think will be more beneficial both from a performance aspect, but also from an injury prevention aspect. And
Hmm.
so, getting stronger should not and is not mutually exclusive with having a lot of flexibility or active mobility. They should actually complement one another.
Hmm. I grew up as a dancer and still dance and compete. I compete in a style called West Coast swing. And
Mm,
for years, I was dancing in a shoe that had a bit of a heel to it. And
mm,
as the shoe would stretch out, the heel cup would loosen up. And then I was really prone to spraining my ankle if I just stepped a little weird. And one of the things I started working on more deliberately for myself was strength around my ankle all the way up the chain, but really thinking ankle a lot. And so I got to the point where my ankle also felt more resilient when it did have that little slip in the shoe sometimes
yep.
because it was able to support it rather than just sort of flopping into it and not
Yep.
knowing what to do with it.
Yep. No, that's a great example of that. And like you said, it's both sort of like on up the chain. So, given your background and expertise, I'm sure there was like a lot of glute work that happened in there to create stability from the femur on down. But then also, that local muscular control as well. And one of the things that, like, in the last few years, I've thought about a lot, just in terms of this flexibility, the talk around flexibility, and stretching in particular, is in the PRI world, people talk a lot about that stretching isn't actually changing tissue, the way a lot of like people when they're stretching think like, oh, I'm changing, like I'm making, this is where like the I want to build long lean muscles comes from. But what you are changing is the pain tolerance that comes with being in those positions, and that's not unimportant. But I think
Mhm,
what it does, when we understand that it's a pain tolerance thing, nervous system thing, it changes the way that we apply stretching. And so, I don't know that I've ever met a dancer who needs to be stretching their hamstrings, but I've met a lot of dancers who talk about like having hamstring tightness. And
mhm,
almost always that's like a neural thing or a positional thing. And that stretching is actually like, it feels better in the moment and then worse later on. That's because it was neural, and the body wants is starving for some mobility, and we're giving it the opposite of that. And so in the
mhm.
moment it feels good, and then later on it tightens up again because the nervous system perceives this like even less stability than it had before. So it's knowing like when and how to apply these different tools, based on the individual's case.
Mhm. And I think that just, solidifies some of the argument for finding someone to work with who has that expertise versus finding a random YouTube video or following that influencer on Instagram who knows where the information's coming from and that sort of thing, because there is so much that we are considering when we're doing that programming for somebody.
Yeah, and I confess, like, I don't know. I just saw a video this morning in my Instagram reels as I was like killing time. And it was a person with a very large following. I think they had like 300,000 followers. This was somebody in
Mhm,
the CrossFit world. And this video given with like the certitude of a man, a Western man.
mhm,
There's no questioning this individual's expertise. And what they were saying was like, stop doing forward lunges. It's not a normal human movement. You should be doing
mhm,
reverse lunges instead, because if you're walking up a mountain, you're not going to walk in a way that mimics like the forward lunge.
mhm,
And if you didn't know, if you weren't an expert in movement or fitness, you would see that video, and you would think like, well, he seems very certain of this and he's very dogmatic. Like I'm going to stop doing like forward lunges.
Mhm.
There's another famous strength coach who I know who has talked about like almost exclusively programming forward lunges because of all these better, like you're working deceleration and you're doing all these things. And so
Yeah.
I think every day I think about like the massive information, and people tend to dunk on like influencers for good reason. Like it's just like some impossibly thin person, their shirt's always off, and
Mhm.
they're like, you know, um, and so like of course, like those, like a lot of times those people are not actually experts; they're just thin. But I think what makes it even more complicated is the just massive amount of contradictory information from people
Mhm.
like me, online. And I still don't know how a consumer with a life to live, you know, laundry to do, sometimes kids to take care, like have a job or whatever, like, or a dancer even, like where there's all this complex choreography and like, oh, there's a guest coming in, I need to go to that class. How do they have time to discern whether this guy is talking nonsense or that guy is talking nonsense?
Right.
It's exceedingly difficult. And so you can't even say find, it would be easy if it was just a matter of like, well, you need to find a dance medicine expert. Well, that doesn't help. The most famous personal trainer to dancers on the planet right now is is not very good at what he does. Like you can look at the social media and look at what he puts out there, and you know that like he's not actually an expert. Like he
Mhm.
actually doesn't engage in professional development. People in my world, the reason he's able to do what he's able to do is because nobody in the strength and conditioning world actually knows who he is. If his stuff managed to filter into strength and conditioning circles, he would be laughed out of the room. But like that's not known, and so he's able to put like these ridiculous exercises. Um,
Mhm.
it's not just ridiculous exercises; it's like misogyny and like sort of like this toxic male gaze on the bodies of the people that he works with.
Mhm.
But there's no way for somebody who doesn't know training to discern whether that barbell arabesque is actually like a good idea, uh,
Right.
and it's not a good idea.
Yes, yes, and I think too, even with training, sometimes you see some of these exercises come up, and it's like, well, I'm reading the description, and okay, what they're saying in the description or the reason that they say they're doing this exercise, I'm not sure that it actually achieves what they're talking about, but it is an exercise that maybe has some other merits to it
Yep.
that, I
Yep.
would explain in a different way, use in a different way. And
Yep.
so it's like, it's not good for what they're saying, but it is still a good exercise for something else. And so
Yep.
even with training, looking at some of this stuff, sometimes it's like, okay, let me sit and analyze this for a second.
Yeah. Right. No, that's exactly right. And I'm sure, like, as a doctor of physical therapy, like you've seen this trend. I don't know how like online you are, but like I see these trends now, and one of my biggest pet peeves now is this trend of like POV. You started doing this one exercise, and all of your back pain went away, and like it's like,
Mhm,
yeah, that one exercise is going to
mhm.
fix literally everyone's back pain, and it's
That would be
just
amazing.
that would be wonderful. But people see that, and if you don't know any better, you don't know like that's actually like nonsense.
Mhm,
Because we don't know why somebody's back is hurting. We don't know their injury history. We don't know their movement. Like we don't know. There's myriad things we don't know. But this person is out there selling like do this one move, and now all of my pain went away.
mhm,
So again, like a lot of the one of the things I said at IADAMS, and I meant this, is like the dance world is about 30 years behind the rest of the strength and conditioning world when it comes to like strength training, um, and conditioning, programming, exercise, like all of these things. It's really about 30 years behind.
mhm,
But a big part of the big part of that reason is again, like people like me, um, selling nonsense in order to accumulate like really large followings because, you know, social media really rewards certitude. It really rewards dogma. It doesn't really reward nuance because it, you know, like you said, there is an exercise that could be wonderful for one person and terrible for another person. And so, but social media isn't great at describing that nuance because
Mhm.
what people want is like, just tell me what to do. Tell me the
Yeah.
one thing I need to do in order to. And the answer usually when it comes to strength and conditioning is like, okay, you're going to do these really boring set of things and you're never going to stop doing them until you die. Like that's actually
Mhm.
the answer. But that's not a wonderful answer to hear. People would much rather hear POV. I started doing this one like hip opener exercise and now my back pain went away and somehow I started making $30,000 a year. Like, you know,
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
um so
Yeah. And I think it's it's something where, like you said, people want kind of that algorithm of if this, then that,
yeah,
as a response to when they're having pain or when they want to improve performance or whatever. What I often notice is even if I have somebody come back years later with this similar complaint of like, I have back pain in the same area, it doesn't mean the same thing is going on. Or if they have a flare up of something, it could be something else is now contributing to it. And so, even somebody that I am very familiar with and have worked extensively with, I need to check them out and get more information. It's not just, oh, here, let me just throw you this exercise or
right.
that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can really tell the people who, you know, it's one thing. This is why, you know, I'm just sort of like naturally my disposition is to be a little bit skeptical of credentials and institutions and gatekeeping. And so, like, somebody calls themselves a dance medicine expert. They graduated, you know, from physical therapy school, or they got an
Mhm.
exercise science degree and an advanced degree, even, but they haven't been keeping up,
Yeah.
and that's just as bad.
Mhm.
So, like, like, there's things that we learned. Like, I remember when I started training, actually started training here in New York in the early 2000s. And I remember we used to tell people like, okay, foam rolling is good because you're breaking down like these like this bad tissue. And like over time, like that's a thing that they actually studied. And it turns out like what we were telling people was absolute nonsense. That's not to say that foam rolling is bad, but the mechanism for its efficacy is much different than what we originally thought. And that's just like one example of like you got to keep up or
Yeah.
else like there's a danger of misapplying a tool or a technique and misapplying a tool or a technique for the individual in front of us. And a big part of that is staying curious, continuing to ask questions, exactly like what you said. Like somebody comes in, even though you've seen them before, they've maybe had similar pains before, but you're not assuming that, you know, I mean, there's humility to that,
Mhm.
because the human body will constantly humble us,
Yes.
because it's just so it's so amazing but also complex, and so like you have to stay curious just like you said.
Mhm. One of the things that I found really valuable too is, there isn't a lot of continuing education available for dance medicine and dance rehab and that sort of thing. A lot of what I have learned has been from my own experience as a dancer and blending
Hmm.
some of that in, but also taking courses in other things that aren't related and thinking about how to translate them, taking
Yep.
courses that aren't even physical therapy based courses. Like
Yep.
that's one of the reasons I love things like Adams, where it brings people from all different professions in there. I like going and learning from the mental health specialists and the dietitians and whomever else and get little tidbits to at least know what I don't know know where
Yeah.
my boundaries are, know who to direct somebody to, what questions to ask, what to be aware of. Because if I only ever went to my physical therapy continuing education courses, there's going to be a big limit in what I actually can walk away with and how I can serve the clients that I work with.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great point. And that, you know, a lot of the professional development that I do and we do as a team, like a lot of it's like actually steeped in the physical therapy world. And what that, like, we're not physical therapists, but what that does is it gives us the ability to talk to physical therapists. And so these should all be these different sort of like lanes of the road. You know, I think of it as like the dancer is in the center, and then the rest of us are sort of like in this like this peripheral sort of thing, and we're linked together, or we should be. But then the dancer is in the center, and the more conversant we are in other disciplines, the better able we are, the better we're able to speak to one another. And that's why I think it's so important. You know, for my, you know, the dance medicine space is, I'd say, still mostly dominated by medical doctors, physical therapists, athletic trainers. There aren't a lot of just like strength coaches. And by
Mhm.
strength coaches, I mean people who spend 90% of their time trying to make people trying to build performance enhancing strength and conditioning programs. I'm not talking about a physical therapist who also has their CSCS, but spends most
Mhm.
of their time like in a clinical practice. It's not the same thing. And I think it's important. That's not a dunk on a physical therapist. It's just to say, like, tell me what you spend most of your time thinking about. And
Yeah.
that's where your expertise lies. I spend most of my time thinking about how to make people jump higher, run faster, lift more, recover faster. I mean, that's my entire world. And so I'll have a relatively sophisticated understanding of those things, but you should not come to me if you want me to rehab an injury, because that's not my expertise. There's all these little nuances that come with these lanes of the road. This is why dietitians are always howling about people dispensing nutrition advice, and a lot of times it's people like me, because there's nuance that
Mhm.
somebody who just has sort of like, you know, my strength and conditioning textbook on the shelf, like there's nutrition sections, but there's nuance that's not in there, that the dietitian who's constantly, you know, has their nose in the research, the latest. I mean, there's all this really interesting stuff coming out around, um you know, like body composition and macronutrient, like
Mm.
but if you're not keeping up,
Yeah.
because you're, I mean, my job is to think about like explosiveness and resting heart rate and all those things, then there's nuance that I could miss, and I could be
Mm.
doing somebody harm by dispensing advice or, you know, nutrition programming that I'm not actually qualified to dispense. But it is important for me to know these things,
Mhm.
so that I can better have a conversation with a dietitian, or better have some just better discernment myself for who to send somebody to. Because it's
Yeah.
not just about the credential. It's like, is this person smart and curious and thoughtful and emotionally intelligent? Um, if I don't know anything about nutrition, then I'm not able to discern those things for myself to refer out.
Mhm. Most definitely. To kind of switch gears a little bit, and this kind of will dovetail into something else here, but thinking about dancers that you work with, whether it is the adolescent dancer, dancer in training, a professional dancer, whomever it may be, what is something that you would like dancers to understand from the strength and conditioning perspective?
That's a really interesting question. The one thing I'll say is that I think the hardest part of my job is actually arguing with other professionals. Like, and what I mean by that is like, not arguing probably isn't the right word, but overcoming the skepticism of people who don't understand what I do.
Mhm.
Um, but I will say the people who I least need to convince are the dancers themselves.
Mm.
It's actually them using their body. Usually within one or two sessions, people like feel like, oh, I get what this is. Yeah, okay, I'm in. It's the other people who aren't actually using their body that are skeptical. And so I say that to say, like, dancers, I feel like, are pretty smart about like what about feeling the difference that good strength training can make in their own body.
Mhm.
I would say that the like in terms of like the one thing I would want people to understand is um, it probably takes a lot less strength and conditioning to support one's dance than they think. And we've had a lot of success with, especially adolescent dancers, with 1 day a week of good strength training. And that's not to say that's optimal, but it like you can. There's a lot of good that you can do with just 1 day a week. I think 2 days a week is probably both the minimum and the maximum. But with even that 1 day a week, with like we said earlier in this discussion, we were talking about how a lot of these young people are just overscheduled and overworked. So for them, a lot of times that 1 day a week
Mhm.
is actually probably enough, and more would just add more stress. So it takes a
Mhm.
lot less than I think most dancers realize. The flip side of that is it has to be thoughtful programming, and it has to be individualized to them in order for that less amount of work to be effective.
Mhm.
If it's just generalized, if it's just like a YouTube video, then they could be spending a lot of time working on exercises that actually don't benefit their individual anatomy or individual artistic concerns. One person may need extension height and explosiveness, and another person actually may need like a better porter bra and you know foot articulation or something like that. And so like
Mhm.
I don't want to spend time applying sort of like explosiveness work to the person who actually is great on that and actually needs better command of their porter bra, vice versa. So
Mhm.
yeah, it can't be random, and if it's not random, if it's intentional and if it's thoughtful, 1 or 2 days a week will get the dancer a lot. Um, and
Yeah.
I think because of the more is more sort of mentality of dance, like that tends to be something that they don't realize.
Definitely. Thinking then of folks who are maybe studio owners, artistic directors, people who are kind of directing things, how things work in an organization of dancers. What is something that you wish they all understood? If you could pick like your number one thing.
Um, I think I think you're seeing more and more people like that, sort of like reaching out to the strength and conditioning world and bringing people in,
Mhm.
or taking their dancers to a facility, which I think is great. I think the thing that I would want them to understand is they don't have the capacity to do these things themselves. Like, this is actually like, you know, fitness, strength and conditioning isn't, um, it's just like anything else. There's nuance. And so, why not, instead of trying to teach a poorly constructed conditioning class for your dancers that will usually involve bad squats, bad push-ups that nobody can actually is strong enough to do in the class. Why not take them to somebody who knows how to do those things? And so
Mhm.
it's just the idea of refer out. And the corollary to that is it doesn't have to be a dance professional. Like, if you find a good strength and conditioning coach in your area,
Mhm.
um their job, like the job of a strength coach, is to evaluate the needs of an athlete and then program accordingly. And so I guess this is the other thing that I wish they understood is like, um, if you look at the college level, so I'll use Ohio State again as an example. Other than like the sort of American football strength and conditioning coaches who are often dedicated to like one team, the other strength and conditioning coaches, like at a college level, they may have the women's soccer team, the men's tennis team, and the diving team or something like that. Like, it
Mhm.
all these disparate sports, and the strength coach didn't play all of those sports. but their job is to evaluate the needs of the student athlete and then program accordingly. And so if you're in an area and you're like, okay, I get it, we need cross training, I don't understand like how to do these things, just find the most reputable strength and conditioning people in your area and take your people to them, or have them come in and run a clinic. You don't have to do it yourself. And I think a lot of us get into trouble when we try to do things for which we don't have the time or the energy. It doesn't mean we're not good professionals.
Yeah.
It just means we don't have the time or the energy to dive as deeply as somebody else who just thinks about this all the time can.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say. I mean, in Dayton, we started sending people to this physical therapist in Indianapolis, who wasn't specifically a dance medicine person, but the physical therapist really helped the dancers that we sent. But we had to overcome this is where we had to overcome some skepticism in the dancers themselves. So the first time we sent somebody there, I was like, listen, I will pay, I will go with you. I just want you to try this. Because it's just the human body. So like, yes, there are specific concerns, for sure. And you don't want, I know dancers a lot of times are nervous that they'll go to somebody who doesn't know dance and they'll be like, wow, you're so flexible. And it's like, yes, I know that, it's part of my job. But somebody who's smart and curious and asks good questions isn't going to do that. And so it's about finding the most competent, curious, emotionally intelligent people available, irrespective of credentialing or gatekeeping or whatever. So that would be my thing with the dance studio people.
Going back to something that you said there too, of thinking of whether it's the dance teacher, studio owners, artistic directors, not having to do it all. A lot of times if I do some sort of teacher training or something like that, I may include some information of, if a dancer is coming to you and they're complaining of X, Y, and Z, that might be a really good opportunity to refer them to somebody like me, a physical therapist, to get more of an evaluation versus kind of the wait and see approach or that kind of thing. But that doesn't mean that I'm expecting you to evaluate the dancer as a whole and decide what their rehab program has to be. It's just, I'm trying to give you some little tidbits, like we were talking about earlier, of just even how we may be receive training ourselves to be able to refer, but like know what to recognize, to know what to do with that information. But it doesn't need to mean that you're the one who takes care of it either.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I've encountered a number of times where, throughout this conversation, I've mentioned the idea of emotional intelligence. And I think it's like a really important aspect of working with a population of people who, because of the culture, there's a lot of anxiety and insecurity. I mean, there's people who are like clinically hypermobile, which can also bring like some of these other aspects, mental and emotional aspects as well. I've encountered a number of times like a dance teacher telling somebody, oh yeah, you probably have like, some like awful thing. Like, yeah, you probably have like a tear there, or you probably have like and it's just like, you're not qualified to, now all you've done is offered an opinion based on nothing, because you don't know what you're talking about. And now you've freaked out this young dancer who already is feeling insecure about their spot, about their roles, about which track they get to dance, like all of these things.
Yeah.
And so like just refer out. Oh man, I'm sorry you're having some pain on the front of your hip. Like, yeah, that can happen in a dance setting. I'm not actually qualified to evaluate that for you, but like there's this really wonderful physical therapist. Here's their name and their number. And then a lot of times what'll happen is they go see somebody like you, they get evaluated, and it's just like, oh, like this is positional. Like, we just need to teach you to like move from a different position that's more advantageous for you. It may mean taking a step back momentarily in some of like your ability to, extend or move your leg or whatever. But if we can get you in this position over time, that pain will dissipate because you're actually in a more biomechanically advantageous position. You're fine. Nothing's broken. Nothing's torn.
Right. Right. Well, and my favorite thing that I shouldn't say always hear, that I sometimes hear from some of my dancers, especially my young dancers who come in, is maybe they did say something to their teacher or an older dancer or somebody, and they do have this like, oh, it sounds like you're getting bunions. I had to get a bunionectomy when I was, 20, and then I just never danced the same way. And it's like, some horror story. And
Yep.
it's like, first of all, whether or not that is actually what's going on with them, but like, don't immediately say, "Oh, yes, my dance career was over," and now they're terrified of what's going to happen, whether or not that's actually the thing going on.
Yep. Yeah,
Words
that's a
matter.
great example. Yeah, words matter. We're talking
Definitely.
to, and especially with young people. I mean, the fear, and it's not just young people, but like professionals, like the fear with that they're walking around with at all times,
Yeah.
um, is just like that's something that we really need to be careful of and respectful
Mhm.
of.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, just that idea, like, yeah, this, I had the same thing. It ended my career. Good luck.
Right. Right, exactly. Yeah, and I think to your point, whether it's, fear or guilt, like I had a dancer I was working with who she was at a spot where it was like, "It really is not a good idea for you to compete this weekend with what's going on.
Mhm.
Like, I'm concerned with your safety right now."
Yep.
And the response being, "But I don't wanna disappoint my teacher. I don't wanna disappoint my classmates. I don't want to put them in this situation," and that sort of thing. And that's a lot of times what I hear from dancers too, is they're concerned about how it affects everybody else before they're concerned about how this actually impacts them as their individual selves, their dance career, their life as a human, going back to that whole idea.
Yep.
But, worried about everybody else and what they're going to say or think or how it's going to impact them.
I mean, that's by design. Like dance culture is designed for them to think that way. Um, and that's, this goes back to the idea of creating safe spaces.
Mhm,
One of the, like the mirror thing is like, I want their cross train, like where people do their cross training to feel nothing like their dance world. I want it to feel almost like, um, I don't know, like a emotionally protective bubble,
mhm,
where they don't get that same sense of you're not going to disappoint. I have to fight. Like that's one of the things, you asked the question earlier about like what would I want dancers to know, and one of the things when I'm first meeting with an artist is I need them to know, and I say this in the beginning, like I need to know when you're not feeling well. I need to know if something hurts. I need to know if you are fried. I don't need to know details, but if something's on your mind, I need to know. People are walking in the door with like breakups or a fight with their parents, or they're coming out,
mhm,
and they're navigating that. Like I don't like all of that stuff. Like we don't just like leave that at the door. We carry those things around with us, and so the like these are we keep coming back to this idea, like these are people,
yeah,
and I think that gets lost. I think that gets lost so often, but I think that it gets lost by design, because this is why like casting is always so murky. Like nobody, like why
mhm,
did you know the if everything is murky, then I can better control you. If everything is murky, but you can't ask questions about casting, then if the guest choreographer touches you inappropriately, you're less likely to say something because it's all murky. And like, did I not get
mhm,
cast because I said like, hey, that guest choreographer was inappropriately touching me needlessly, or did I not get cast because this person is better for the role? Like all of that sort of like murkiness just plays into an exercise of control of the individuals, and so they learn that, and then they move through all of the spaces like that.
mhm,
And so a big part of my work is to let them know, like I need to know like when you're not well, or when something is going on. And I say I don't need details because I don't want people to have to mine their trauma, just like
mhm,
we can squat, irrespective of if I know the details. But often what happens is you create that safe space and they're going to tell you, like I've had kids come out to me. I've had there's all of these things that when you truly create a safe space, it you're teaching, especially adolescents, you're modeling for them how they ought to be treated.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had the experience a number of times where people start to question, like, wait a minute, like, you always ask for my consent before touching me.
Mm-hmm.
That's weird because, like, in these other instances, like, nobody is asking my consent. You
Yeah.
always like seem to inquire. You always tell me like it's okay if I'm feeling a pain here and we can work around it. And there's other things we can do. Like I don't get that other places. So you're
Mm-hmm.
by like performative things had like performative has become like a pejorative term. Like, oh, that's just performative, like whatever. And it's
Yeah.
like, no, for the kids, I am performing. I'm performing the idea of consent
Mm-hmm.
because I want them to like my job if I'm coaching a child is like I'm a teacher. Like I'm an adult in their life. And so it is up to me to perform, especially as a man, ideas around consent and touching and
Mm-hmm.
how I speak to them,
Mm-hmm.
how I care for them, how I communicate with them. So yeah, I mean the that idea like they're going to disappoint a teacher is just like
Yeah.
that's on the teacher. The
Mm-hmm.
teacher hasn't created a safe space because
Mm-hmm.
if the teacher had created a safe space, yes, I'll be sad that you're not performing with the team this weekend. But like, do you like? Oh, your physical therapist says you need to like, yeah, take care of yourself because what I care about is the version of you 20 years from now who doesn't have to have a double hip replacement.
Yep.
So like, yeah, I got you. Like, let me know how you're doing. Like, send me
Yep.
a text. That's what it should be.
Mm-hmm. I know, like, I often will talk with the dancers I work with where it's like, maybe we did some sort of intervention that I'm hoping will change their pain that they're experiencing, but it doesn't always happen. Sometimes we need to
Sure.
try different things out. And I'll say, okay, go ahead and move around. Let's test this out again, see if it feels any different. And I always say, I want to know it's not
Yep.
going to hurt my feeling if it
Yep.
made no difference.
Yep.
Or things like when we're reviewing exercises in their home program. Okay, are there some that feel really good to you and feel like they're doing a lot of benefit? Are there some that you don't really notice, like you don't know why you're doing, or honestly that you're just sick of? Because that's important for me to know too, and
Yep.
and I have those conversations with them, and that helps with the buy-in, that helps with their adherence to treatment programs, and all of that kind of stuff, because they know that I'm paying attention and care, and it's not just here, do these things.
Yeah, exactly. We often, and I don't actually know if this is more of a Western thing or if this is true around. I imagine it's true in a lot of different places, but the idea that children aren't people and have no agency.
Mhm.
Um, and I've taught like in public school a couple of different times, and one of the things that drives kids crazy is sort of like mindless work. Like,
Yeah.
why, Mr. Harrison, why are we doing this? And if you don't have a real answer, you may have lost that kid.
Mhm.
Now
Mhm.
some people are the reason they're doing this is because they're told to do it and they will fall in line. And those tend to be like the people who are like good students. Um, but a lot of times kids just want to know why. They want to be listened to.
Yeah.
And so if an exercise is not effective, but you're saying like you still need to do that, you're actually losing some buy-in there because they can feel it's not making a difference.
Mhm.
They've just told you it's not making a difference, and yet you're saying like, no, you still need to do this.
Mhm.
I want everybody I work with to know that when I suggest a thing, it's because I think it'll be helpful to them.
Yeah.
And if I get feedback to the contrary, I'm not going to have them keep doing it. Even as exactly like you said, like sometimes it's just like tedious and boring, and not everybody can handle that. And
Yeah.
so you need to find a way in there that matches with whatever that personality type is.
Mhm.
Um, this goes back to the idea of like really good relationships between physical therapists and strength and conditioning coaches, because one of the things that like I'll do with people is, if somebody's coming back from an injury, they get homework from their physical therapist, but they're just like, yeah, I haven't been doing it. I'm like, all right, no, that's fine. Like we can incorporate this as part of a superset.
Mhm.
so that you at least you get some reps and you have eyes on you to do some of these exercises that you're just not able to do at home on your own. And
Mhm.
people beat themselves up about that, but like that's the entire reason that like a fitness industry exists is because people have trouble doing things on their own sometimes. And it's
Mhm.
just helpful to have that support of a person in the room who's like watching you do those things. And so
Yeah.
it's just like, let's do your big strength lift. Let's do your overhead dumbbell press. And then as part of a superset, you're going to sit on the floor and you're going to do, these like breathing drills or something like that you've been assigned. And that's a good
Mhm.
way of like combining all that stuff into one session. But if you don't have a good relationship with the physical therapist, you're not going to understand the exercises, and you may not even be communicative about like the why and the what of those exercises.
Mhm.
So that's why this sort of like all-encompassing team approach is what should be the standard, but obviously
Yeah.
isn't.
Yes, unfortunately. We'll keep working on it.
Yes.
So at this point, I think it is a wonderful opportunity for a special segment on the show. So we've got the final bow. This is essentially the take home message. In this episode, we've talked about a lot of different ideas. We've talked to different audiences, whether it is our colleagues in the health and fitness and medicine world, dancers, studio owners, whomever. If somebody walks away with one piece of information, what do you hope they walk away with?
Um, I want them to walk away with the idea that strength and conditioning for dance, or in the sort of like nomenclature of dance, cross training for dance, it needs to be intentional. It doesn't have to be complex. It doesn't even have to look good, but it has to be intentional. When I started as a personal trainer back in the early 2000s, the person who sort of like taught me how to be a trainer, she said to me, the most important question you can ask is why are you doing that? And that's, that stuck with me. And I always ask that with any exercise, with any program, why are you doing that? Because dancers they're so overworked, they're so stressed, um, they're so overscheduled that literally to an exercise, to a set, why are you doing 3 sets of that instead of just two? Like we need to have answers for those things. So that's
Yes,
that's what I would say.
I love that. Last piece, the shameless plug. So, this is your opportunity to talk about anything that you have going on, anything that you want to promote. So, have at it.
Sure. I don't have an. I mean, what I would say is follow Present Tense Fitness on Instagram, presenttensefitness.com. I have three wonderful colleagues, Susan, Anna, and Callie, that I work with. Anna and Callie are in Dayton, Ohio. Susan and I are here in New York City. And so if you are a dancer, particularly in Dayton or New York, and you'd like to work with us, I'm at Jason at presenttensefitness.com. Get in touch. And I'd love to hear more about, what the artistic and athletic concerns are, so that we can help coach you up.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Jason, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure. I'll make sure to share out all the information so that they can find you easily.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me on and the really interesting conversation. I really appreciate it. It means a lot to me, to have opportunities like this with other people in this space. So truly, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Dance Med Spotlight is hosted and produced by Alyssa Arms. We discuss all things dance medicine. This has been another episode from Dance Med Spotlight. The Dance Med Spotlight is intended for educational purposes only. No clinical decision making should be based solely on one source. While care is taken to ensure accuracy, factual errors can be present.